I am now delighted to introduce Smitha Milli. Was just finishing up a postdoc at Cornell Tech and might have information about what's next on their plate, but who's been doing a lot of thinking about and writing about ranking content for healthy outcomes. This audience is probably aware that platforms tend to rank content by what is most likely to drive up engagement, and that those engagement algorithms can have some negative side effects for individuals and society. But what can or should platforms be doing instead? So our guest Smitha has researched not just how engagement algorithms are problematic, but also how platforms can do better by ranking content by user value. Smitha was also co-author of a workshop paper many of you have seen and is in the event doc, which I'll share again in a second, that synthesize field-wide knowledge around ranking algorithms for good and bad, which is all to say Smitha is incredibly knowledgeable in this area, and we're lucky they can join us today to give a strong footing on how to fix our feeds. Welcome, Smitha.
Thanks, Julia.
So to start off, even though I said we all probably know that ranking content by engagement alone is undesirable, it might not be an obvious fact to everybody. So can you start by sharing what evidence makes you think makes you believe that we should not just use engagement indicators?
Yeah, there's been, first of all, a ton of correlational evidence showing that ranking by engagement tends to predict producing more hostile, angry, divisive content. But more importantly, I think recently there's also more and more experimental evidence showing that ranking by engagement actually leads to these kinds of negative downstream outcomes. So I'll just describe one experiment, which is one that we did as an example for what might be a typical kind of way to assess this. So one experiment we did that was linked in the Luma doc is we actually collected a group of, or we recruited a group of Twitter users last year, February of last year. And for each of those users, we collected tweets from their engagement-based timeline and their chronological timeline. So basically we have for each of these users, here's what they would have seen if their timeline was ranked by engagement, and here's what they would have seen under a chronological baseline. And that allows us to understand what are the effects of this engagement-based ranking relative to, say, a chronological baseline. What we found in that study was that the engagement-based timeline was more likely to amplify content that was angry, hostile, divisive, that users said made them feel worse about their political outgroup. So if you were a left-leaning user, you saw more content that made you feel worse about the right, and vice versa. So that's just one example of here's an experimental way to get at what are the effects of ranking by engagement. But I think something kind of interesting is that we did find was we also just asked people, is this the kind of content that you want to see? And it turns out that people didn't even prefer the political tweets picked by the engagement-based ranking algorithm compared to just the chronological timeline. And so that's really interesting because presumably the engagement-based timeline is causing people to engage more. And so these are tweets predicted to be highly engaging, but on reflection, people are saying that they didn't actually want to see this kind of content. And so something interesting we did as part of this experiment is we wondered what would happen if we ranked content by users' stated preferences, by basically asking the question, is this the kind of tweet you want to see? And trying to rank based on that. And what we found was that ranking by user stated preferences compared to ranking by engagement really reduced the amount of hostile, divisive political content that was shown to them. So compared to both chronological and stated preferences, engagement ranking leads to more divisive content. So this is kind of what I've described so far as just short-term effects. This is effects on content and effects on what people are saying in the moment. I don't want to see this in the moment. There's also the Meta 2020 election studies, which tried to measure the effects of randomizing users to either engagement-based ranking or the chronological ranking, and then surveyed them after 3 to 6 months, surveying them using typical political polarization, effective polarization measures, among other things. And those studies basically found no effects, where it was like ranking by engagement just doesn't seem to move anything related to people's beliefs or attitudes. So you might wonder, how do you kind of like, how do you merge these two facts where it seems so obvious that ranking by engagement produces worse content in terms of divisiveness, but on the other hand, it doesn't change people's beliefs? I think there's multiple interpretations here. You know, one could be that it's really hard to measure the true counterfactual because, you know, producers adapt to the engagement-based ranking algorithm. When you change the algorithm, people start changing what kind of content they make. So if the algorithm incentivizes angry content, then maybe people start posting more angry content, and you're not going to be able to evaluate that effect when you just compare the chronological engagement-based timelines. So I don't think that we know for sure what the long-term effects are, and I think, like, given that uncertainty and the other kinds of evidence about short-term effects, we probably still want to, you know, redesign in ways that are more pro-social. Another piece of evidence that I think we should take into account is just what producers say. So we know from the Facebook files that producers have literally said that the algorithm has caused them to make big changes to what they create. For example, one Polish political party said after a change to Facebook's ranking algorithm, they moved from posting 50-50 positive negative posts to posting 80% negative posts, 20% positive posts. So that means more posts, you know, probably attacking the other side and so on. And so I think if you know that producers are literally saying we are adapting a lot in ways we don't like to the algorithm, then we should imagine there could be some long-term effects going on here. Yeah.
Thank you. So that kind of leads to the next question. So we know you mentioned already that, you know, when using a chronological feed is not a really good alternative. What should the alternatives be? What should platforms, or actually, what are the ideas out there before we get to your particular recommendations? Because I know you have some. Give us a little bit of the lay of the land. What are the alternatives? What are platforms trying? What are some people recommending?
Yeah, so the alternatives to ranking by engagement, I can kind of break into two categories. One is still in this optimizing for individual personalization paradigm, and the second is going to get out of the pure personalization paradigm. So in the first setting, it's basically trying to optimize for better signals than engagement, which we think of engagement as being, you know, like clicks, likes, comments, replies. There's many types of engagement, but in contrast, you could imagine doing something like optimizing for stated preference. So an example of this would be the see less, see more button on Facebook, or, you know, I don't want to see this. Facebook has been heavily investing into see less, see more. And I think a big difference in making these kinds of signals useful is how easy you make them for users to use that feedback. So they moved the see less, see more out of, before you had to like right click the item and then you would get a drop down and like you'd eventually be able to say see less, see more. Now it just like appears on the post. And so that means you get way more of that data and it's much easier to optimize for. So a UX change can make these kinds of signals much easier to optimize. So that's one, is trying to use individual stated preferences from these kinds of user controls. See less, see more, I don't want to see this, show me more of this, etc. The second kind of, again, individual metric that people have thought about doing is things that are more survey-based. So instead of it being on an item level, asking people randomly every week, you know, have you had a meaningful interaction on this platform? That is nice in that you can maybe get at broader measures of well-being, but it's also more complicated to optimize. And I don't think I've seen anyone able, like, I've seen any example of somebody doing this. And it might be that somebody is internally, but I haven't seen anything public about it really. And then the third one that people often look at is, of course, long-term retention. There's lots of companies that try to learn proxies, surrogates for a long-term retention metric. So the idea is your machine learning model can't directly optimize for long-term retention because that's not something that's on the item level. You know, it's not like user liked this post. So long-term retention, instead, people try to create other functions that are good proxies for long-term retention that they can optimize for. So these are all still things that are in this personalization paradigm of we want to personalize completely to each individual. And basically the idea behind all of them is if engagement is noisy, what is a different kind of individual metric that is more related to user value? And this covered, a lot of these are covered in this workshop paper that I was a part of. It's like what we know about the use of non-engagement signals in content rankings. You can check that out. It was basically this workshop we was led by 4 great organizers, not me, and they invited a bunch of people from different companies and a few researchers to share what they what people have done within these major companies to try to optimize for non-engagement signals. So the second paradigm I would describe that I think is newer and gaining more traction is to get outside of this idea that we should fully personalize everything. There's obviously some things which we don't want to personalize. For example, you're not getting personalized fact checks, hopefully. And similarly, it could be that for certain types of sensitive content, like political content, we don't need to use full personalization. And there's some platforms that don't do full personalization and still have, a big community, like a Reddit, a subreddit. It is not necessarily personalized your home pages, but not within the community itself. So one thing you can do is think about not just what is this individual user going to engage with, but how would other people think about this item? So it's like if you're trying to recommend something to a particular person with a particular political belief, what do people with maybe other political beliefs think of this item? And one proposal that's recently been made is this idea of bridging-based ranking here. So the idea is we should uplift content that has diverse approval from people with many different viewpoints. The intuition behind this is that if there's something that, a bunch of people who normally disagree feel is a good post, then that is maybe something that is very constructive, that bridges between different viewpoints. And so perhaps this kind of bridging content can also aid in depolarization. I'll stop there maybe.
No, that is fantastic. You're being so thorough, so clear. I'm loving this, and I'm learning a lot myself. I'm going to ask one more question before we open it up to the floor. So if folks have questions for Smitha, start thinking of those, and feel free to also start dropping them in the chat. So last question, in one of your papers, you use a term that value faithfulness as a way that platforms should be thinking about ranking content. Can you just talk a little bit more about what you mean by that? What kind of indicators would go into value faithfulness, and how they might be calculated?
Yeah, so that is a term I used in a more theoretical paper where we were basically looking at what properties of different user behaviors on platforms mean that we should weigh them more or less. So what I mean is like on any given platform, you have lots of user behaviors you could use as signals for ranking, clicks, likes, retweets, comments, etc. How should you weigh those different behaviors together? And one property we talk about is this idea of value faithfulness. Some behaviors are more indicative of the user's kind of reflective value than others. So for example, a click is not super value faithful because users might click on things just for lots of reasons. Like maybe there is a clickbaity headline, but if you ask them on reflection, was this item that you clicked on something that you valued seeing? That probably has a lower correlation compared to some other kinds of behaviors like liking it, something that's more explicitly about the preference for recommendations. So for example, a see less, see more button where the intent is specifically recommendation is more related to this question of, is this an item that you valued? So it's basically how much is this behavior correlated with, do you value this item?
Fantastic. I want to be able to let people have an opportunity to ask their questions. So we're going to move to the Q&A and we'll just end the recording here.